Welcome to Huff Goes to the Movies. My name is Eric Huffman II. Most people call me Huff, and some people know that I love going to the movies. Fast X hits theaters on May 19th, and before we get to that point, I want to revisit all the films in the Fast and Furious franchise, week by week, in a series called Toretto Tuesdays. And we are here at week 7, so it is time to talk about the highest grossing film in the franchise, Furious 7, which hit theaters in 2015 and had a bunch of emotions going into it. First things to mention is that Justin Lin, who had directed Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, Fast and Furious, Fast 5, Fast and Furious 6, did not come back to direct this film. I believe it was a scheduling issue for him. He was actually directing Star Trek Beyond, which would come out the next year, so I think there were some issues with his availability, and he unfortunately couldn't come onto the project. So they got James Wan of Conjuring fame, of Insidious fame, of Saw fame. It's interesting. James Wan had really stamped his name in the history books for all the different franchises he created in the horror genre. He created Saw, even though he only directed that first film. He was one of the spearheads of the Conjuring franchise. He directed the first 2 Insidious films. While those things had become franchises in their own right, it was interesting for him to be making this jump to something that is big, broad appeal, action spectacle. What I love about Furious 7 is that James Wan approached this as a fan who wanted to put his own stamp on these movies. So from the very beginning, we see stylistically that James Wan is not going to just try to copy what Justin Lin did in the previous installments. And that's something that I think has been a gift for the Fast and Furious films. I love the fact that no matter who is directing these films, those directors are allowed to put their own touches on these movies. Having James Wan come in, having someone who had a style, had a sense of fun to him, knew different ways that he would want to turn things up a bit, I think that that only helped this film. And the foundation had already been laid through the previous installments. You had the characters who had sort of been brought back from the original films. We had seen their experiences in Fast 5 and Fast and Furious 6. Letty had returned. The Rock had been added to the equation. And now you had a sense of what they were doing on a global scale. So Furious 7 was really allowed to run wild when it comes to taking advantage of the types of films that these movies had evolved into. And we can see that in some of these massive, giant action set pieces here. There, of course, is the, I will call it iconic, sort of skydive sequence with these cars. And I remember seeing that in the trailer and thinking, there's no way they're actually doing this. And as they cut it together in the trailer, you see bits and pieces of this long sequence, but seeing that on the big screen for the first time, I remember being there on opening weekend and just having my jaw on the floor. The stunt work here, combined with the visual effects, combined with how they set up this sequence, is incredible. And I love the fact that this one sequence in the film almost functions as its own story. It has a beginning with the skydiving, it has the middle part where they attack the convoy, and then it has sort of a chaotic third act that involves buses flying off of cliffs and cars driving off of mountains. It's all absurd and it's crazy, but something that James Wan does very well in not just this film, but in later films that he would do, even though the action feels very fast-paced, it's super kinetic, hyper-kinetic if you will, and things are cutting like every half second, there's just this pace that he's able to keep up that keeps the audience sort of gripped into their seats. And I think that in watching Furious 7, something that I notice now is just how many cuts are in this movie. It is moving at such a breakneck pace, but you're never bored. You're never overwhelmed. You're kind of just hanging on for this thrill ride. And that really is what this movie is. It is a thrill ride. And I love the fact that James Wan would later go on to direct Aquaman based on a comic book, because I think that he took the opportunity for Furious 7 to feel like something from a comic book. The way that Vin Diesel and The Rock deliver these one-liners, the way that Jason Statham's character is framed, just these massive, massive action beats, the increased use of visual effects here. This came out the same year as Avengers Age of Ultron, and I'll be honest, I have never really been a big fan of Avengers Age of Ultron. I actually think this was the best superhero movie that came out this year when you compare it to that Avengers movie and the first Ant-Man that would come out a few months later. Every time I watch this movie, I am blown away by the fact that it exists. I am blown away by the fact that something that started with a Point Break ripoff of thieves trying to take DVD players, now we are on globe-trotting missions, skydiving out of planes, taking down military convoys, rescuing super hackers. It really feels like they had a long list of things that people thought would never happen in these movies, and they just slowly started checking them off. But the biggest thing about Furious 7 that I think is an absolute miracle is how this film sustained the tragic loss of Paul Walker. Paul Walker had been part of this franchise from the original film. He plays the protagonist in The Fast and the Furious. It is his decision to come back for Too Fast, Too Furious that I think actually keeps this franchise going. And for him to come back in Fast and Furious, for that character to reunite with Dominic Toretto and Mia and Letty, and to be able to go on this journey as these films got bigger and bigger. Paul Walker was someone who, I'll be honest, I think if you go back and watch those first few films, you can probably be critical of his performance. But I love that as these movies kept going, he just became much more comfortable in the role, and he really did embody, I think, a dynamic of this franchise that is missing right now. Brian O'Connor as a character is someone who adds a bit of formula, a bit of convention that I think this franchise needs to balance out some of the absurdity that comes with its big action set pieces. And you know, I've really missed a character like that in these films. I thought that Scott Eastwood might reintroduce some of that when he was introduced in Fate of the Furious, but he's only in that movie. He didn't come back for F9. But the loss of Paul Walker at the time, I remember that being a huge shock because they were in the middle of filming this movie. And when I compare something like this to, say, Black Panther Wakanda Forever, in which Chadwick Boseman passed away as the script was being finished and before they were supposed to start shooting, this film really didn't have the leeway of being able to completely reinvent a story that would somehow allow for them to either recast the role or for them to be able to somehow write him out of it. But I like how they treat this here. And I'm sure at this point everyone sort of knows how the movie handles that, but that tribute to Paul Walker to close out this film, I don't cry in a lot of movies, but I was misty-eyed. I mean, I really was sort of taken aback at just how sincere and how beautiful it was. And something that the film does all throughout is it really teases this idea of one last funeral. This film is sort of driven into action as the characters find out about Jason Statham's character, Deckard Shaw, killing Han. And so they find out that they're on the hunt and that they need to find a way to stop Shaw before he can get them. And there's a line that Tyrese says where he goes, "I don't want to go to any more funerals, Brian. I don't want to go to any more funerals." And Brian looks at him and says, "There's only one more funeral to go to, and that's his," him being Deckard Shaw. So the film has these moments where it feels like it's foreshadowing the loss of the Brian character. And going into this film, unless I missed something, guys, Fast and Furious faithful, let me know. But I don't recall the studio or anyone in the production team ever really announcing what they were going to do as far as addressing Paul Walker's death on camera. So all through the film, there is this bit of dread about what might happen. And, you know, for a film that is very much rooted in these absurd bits of action and steadily breaking the laws of physics, it did give the film a sense of stakes that I don't know that these movies have ever really had. Yes, the stakes have been elevated as the films have sort of leaned into, like, bigger and bigger action, but as far as being worried about what would happen with characters, I don't know that these films have ever really had a lot of that. And this film is structured in a way, and it's shot in a way, and it has these moments where, you know, if you have no idea what's going to happen at the end of this movie, like, I think most of the audience did not, it really did put you on edge. I remember being in the theater with a bunch of my cousins, and I just kept looking over to them thinking, they're not going to do this, are they? Like, this can't happen, right? For this film to be able to complete production, despite the loss of Paul Walker, and for them to be able to find a way to do a really awesome, loving, and sweet tribute to him and his character and what he has meant to this franchise, I just thought was a masterclass of filmmaking and storytelling, and my hat's off to James Wan and Chris Morgan and Vin Diesel, the entire team, for being able to make that moment work. An argument could be made that perhaps that was the best conclusion that the Fast and Furious franchise was ever going to get, but when you have a movie like this come out and make $1.5 billion, I think this movie made more than the Avengers movie that came out just a few weeks after it. At the end of its theatrical run, I believe Furious 7 might have been, no pun intended, the 7th highest grossing movie in history. Now, obviously, it's not there anymore because more films have come out, including a bunch of Star Wars movies and a lot more Marvel movies, but I think this film was far too successful for Universal to decide to leave it alone. I know people get cynical about studios only making movies to make money, but at the same time, the Fast and Furious franchise had clearly risen to a new level, and I don't blame Universal for wanting to continue that. These films really did represent something very different in Hollywood at the time. These films are not based on pre-existing IP. These films are PG-13 and not really for children, but these films are made to play to a pretty broad audience, and they have assembled a cast that is racially and ethnically diverse in a way that feels organic, in a way that doesn't feel like some studio exec said, hey, we need a little bit more color. When you have guys like John Singleton, Justin Lin, and James Wan up to this point, the majority of the time, it's been a person of color who's been in the director's chair. And so with all of that, the franchise was still able to evolve to the point where it's able to compete with the likes of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't blame Universal for looking at all of that and saying, yeah, we have a good thing going here, and maybe we should find a way to continue it. Now, I certainly have my thoughts on the films that follow this, but for my money, Furious 7 is a great time. It is not quite the same as the films that preceded it. It is a film in which it allows a director to really flex his creative muscles and really put his stamp on a franchise that had really started to forge its own identity. And I think it still holds up. I think that the skydive sequence is still one of the best action sequences of the last 10, 15 years. And I cannot wait to see how they attempt to live up to the success that this film has had when FX comes out later this year. But for all these reasons, I would have to give Furious 7 a 4 out of 5 stars. Rest in peace to Paul Walker. I still can't believe this movie was able to pull that off. But I am so excited to see where this franchise goes when FX comes out later this year. And of course, if you haven't already, please do check out the other Toretto Tuesday videos. I've gone through all of the films in order of release, so obviously next week I will be getting into The Fate of the Furious, and then Hobbs and Shaw, and F9. And then at the end of the series, I will be doing a ranking of all the Fast and Furious films, including Fast X. So guys, thank you so much. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. That always helps. If you have not already, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. That way you can stay up to date on everything that I've got going on here. Once again, my name is Eric Huffman II. Most people call me Huff. Stay sweaty, my friends. Salute me familia. I'll see you at the movies. Peace.